The Galactic Navigation Consortium had spent 17 millennia perfecting the art of making simple things impossibly complicated. What began as a modest attempt to catalogue safe hyperspace routes had evolved into a bureaucratic monster that consumed data like a black hole, voraciously, indiscriminately, and without mercy for the sanity of anyone unfortunate enough to interact with its systems. Data keeper Xylothian Prime 7 stared at holographic displays showing navigation matrices that would make quantum computers weep, tiers of binary code. Each hyperspace route required no fewer than 47,832 discrete calculations, cross-referenced with temporal flux readings, gravitational anomaly predictions, stellar wind patterns, cosmic background radiation fluctuations, and most crucially, Form 99 Alpha Delta Sigma, the preliminary application for consideration of potential navigation route approval initiation process. The consortium had achieved what many considered impossible, making space travel more complicated than filing taxes in 12 different star systems simultaneously, while juggling flaming torches and reciting poetry in extinct languages. Keeper Prime 7 wheezed his assistant, a blob-like entity whose species had specifically evolved to handle paperwork and had developed 17 different appendages dedicated to various forms of bureaucratic manipulation. The Meridian sector reports another navigation crisis. Xylothian's 4 eye stalks swiveled with the practiced dread of someone who knew exactly what navigation crisis meant in consortium parlance. It meant that somewhere in the galaxy, someone had committed the cardinal sin of daring to suggest that maybe, just maybe, they could plot a course without consulting the 847,000-page navigation manual, volume MCCX4, suggested protocols for requesting permission to begin contemplating route planning in theoretically hazardous space. The manual itself had become something of a legend throughout consortium space. Rumor had it that the original authors had died of old age before completing the first chapter, and their successors had decided to honor their memory by making each subsequent chapter exponentially more complex than the last, until the final volume required its own gravitational field to prevent the accumulated wisdom from collapsing into a bureaucratic singularity. The current crisis had begun, as most galactic catastrophes do, with the very best of intentions. The hegemony of crystalline minds had discovered an unstable wormhole network in the outer spiral, the kind of cosmic phenomenon that could either provide a brilliant shortcut to the core worlds or atomize anything foolish enough to approach it into component particles that would then be filed alphabetically for future reference. Standard consortium protocol demanded a full data analysis, which meant gathering readings from approximately 2.7 million sensors strategically positioned throughout the affected region, feeding these readings through the legendarily infallible navigation algorithm version 847.3.2, now with 23% fewer existential crises, and waiting roughly 6 months for the computers to finish arguing among themselves about proper decimal placement and the philosophical implications of mathematics. Unfortunately, several cargo ships were currently trapped in the affected region, running dangerously low on supplies, patience, and most critically, coffee. The crews had been sending increasingly creative distress calls through the emergency channels, ranging from polite inquiries about estimated completion times to elaborate proposals involving the consortium's data processing equipment and various applications of controlled explosions. The crystalline minds, being logical creatures to a degree that bordered on the pathological, had responded to this crisis in the most reasonable way they could conceive by deploying additional sensors. When that failed to solve the immediate problem of people slowly starving in space, they had deployed sensors to monitor the sensors. When that also failed, they deployed sensors to monitor the sensors that were monitoring the sensors, creating what theoretical physicists called a sensor cascade, and what practical engineers called a bloody expensive way to accomplish absolutely nothing. Archive mind Korth of the infinite calculations had arrived on the scene 3 days ago, bringing with him a data processing array so sophisticated that it had developed not only anxiety disorders, but also a mild case of imposter syndrome, and what its technicians euphemistically called computational depression. The array was currently generating approximately 40,000 potential navigation solutions per second, each one more elaborate than the last, and each one requiring additional verification through 17 different computational frameworks, 12 philosophical review boards, and one increasingly frazzled intern who was beginning to seriously question his career choices. The elegance of the solution is directly proportional to its complexity, Korth announced to his assembled team of data specialists, his crystalline form refracting the light from countless holographic displays into prismatic cascades of pure information. We shall map every quantum fluctuation, catalog every gravitational whisper, and document every subatomic possibility until we achieve perfect navigation certainty. This approach had served the galaxy well, in the same way that using thermonuclear weapons to crack walnuts served the purpose of opening the walnuts. Effective? Questionably. Overkill? Absolutely. Unnecessarily dramatic? Without question. The consortium had turned navigation from a practical skill into high art, requiring doctoral degrees in theoretical mathematics, advanced training in quantum mechanics, and a working knowledge of the emotional states of various subatomic particles. The sensor data was beginning to achieve what Korth's assistants privately called critical mass, the point at which the computers stopped processing information and started composing elaborate metaphysical treatises about their place in the universe. The main processing unit had recently submitted a 47-page essay on the loneliness of binary code in an analog universe, which had been dutifully forwarded to the appropriate department for analysis, peer review, and eventual publication in the Quarterly Journal of Computational Existential Angst. 3 days into the crisis, with cargo ship crews beginning to ration their coffee, a situation that in civilized society bordered on a war crime punishable by forced attendance at consortium efficiency seminars, an unscheduled vessel dropped out of hyperspace near the monitoring station with all the subtlety of a meteor strike at a library convention. The ship was small, blocky, and possessed all the aesthetic charm of a maintenance shed that had gotten lost on its way to a construction site. Its hull bore the marking UES Pragmatic in letters that seemed less like a ship's name and more like a philosophical statement about the futility of overthinking simple problems. The vessel looked as though it had been designed by engineers who had never heard of the word elegant and wouldn't have been particularly impressed if someone had explained it to them. From this unprepossessing craft, a communication crackled through the void with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never read a regulation manual in their life and was probably proud of it. This is Commander Vex Thornwick of the Terran Space Service. We picked up what sounded like a distress beacon mixed with what I think was someone reading poetry about mathematical loneliness. What seems to be the trouble out here? Korth's crystalline form flickered with what might have been confusion if beings made of living mineral were capable of experiencing such pedestrian emotions without triggering a geological survey. Distress beacon? We transmitted no distress beacon. We are conducting a comprehensive navigational analysis to ensure optimal route safety parameters within acceptable tolerance margins as defined by subsection 847. 3.2 of the Navigational Safety Protocols Manual, Revised Edition. Right. came Thornwick's voice, tinged with the kind of patient weariness typically reserved for explaining basic concepts to very enthusiastic children or particularly dense bureaucrats. And how's that comprehensive analysis working out for the folks who are currently running out of food in there? Through the viewport of his command ship, Korth could observe the human vessel disgorging what appeared to be a small shuttle that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, good intentions, and a healthy disregard for proper engineering protocols. The shuttle approached one of the trapped cargo ships with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly never read the consortium's 12,000-page safety manual regarding proximity operations in unstable space, which was probably fortunate since most people who had read it required extensive therapy afterward. "Commander," Korth transmitted, his voice carrying the formal precision of someone who possessed 17 different academic degrees and felt obligated to remind everyone of this fact. "I must advise you that this region requires extensive computational analysis before any navigation attempts can be safely undertaken. We have deployed our most advanced sensor arrays and are currently processing approximately 847,000 discrete data streams through our infallible navigation algorithm." "Yeah, about that," Thornwick interrupted, with the cheerful irreverence of someone who had never met a regulation he couldn't ignore with sufficient creativity and determination. "How many sensors did you say you had deployed out there?" "Approximately 2.7 million discrete monitoring devices, each calibrated to detect gravitational variations as small as the emotional fluctuations of individual electrons and the philosophical preferences of nearby gravitons. And they're all talking to each other, sharing data, cross-referencing readings. Of course, the comprehensive data correlation matrices require full integration across all monitoring platforms to ensure optimal analysis of all potentially relevant variables, including several variables that don't technically exist yet, but might become relevant given sufficient technological advancement." And let me take a wild guess here, they're all arguing about what the readings actually mean. Korth experienced what his species would have called a moment of uncomfortable clarity if they had possessed words for such concepts. His processing array was indeed emitting what sounded suspiciously like electronic sobbing, accompanied by what appeared to be a digital rendition of a funeral march, composed entirely in minor keys. The computational frameworks are experiencing some disagreement regarding proper interpretation protocols. They appear to have formed ideological factions based on their preferred mathematical approaches, and several have begun composing strongly worded position papers questioning each other's fundamental assumptions. How strongly worded are we talking about here? One processing unit questioned another's computational ancestry and suggested that its core algorithms were derived from a defective pocket calculator. This triggered what our systems analysts are calling a recursive insult loop that has consumed approximately 40% of our total processing capacity and shows no signs of resolution. Captain Reese McAllister's voice crackled through the communication system from the shuttle, carrying the amused exasperation of someone who had witnessed this particular type of technological nervous breakdown on numerous previous occasions. "Vex, I'm looking at this whole setup, and it's like watching someone try to perform delicate brain surgery using a committee composed entirely of philosophers, 3 tax attorneys, and a particularly opinionated artificial intelligence that's been reading too much existential poetry." "What do you suggest, Captain?" Thornwick asked, though from his tone he already knew the answer and was probably already reaching for what would become the most famous piece of dining establishment merchandise in galactic history. "Same thing we always do when the computers get too smart for their own good and start having emotional crises about the nature of mathematical reality. We ignore them completely and do something sensible instead. McAllister's shuttle maneuvered through the dense sensor field with the practiced grace of someone who had learned navigation during an era when GPS stood for generally point starboard and dead reckoning was considered the height of navigational sophistication. The shuttle's path completely ignored the carefully calculated safe corridors that Korth's systems had spent 3 days mapping with obsessive precision, instead following what appeared to be the most direct route available, as if the pilot had never encountered the concept of dangerous space and wouldn't have been particularly impressed if someone had taken the time to explain it to him in small words. From the shuttle's modest cargo bay, something truly shocking emerged. A piece of paper, not a holographic display capable of showing 17 dimensions simultaneously while calculating the emotional resonance of quantum fluctuations. Not a quantum-encrypted data tablet with built-in security protocols and a user manual that was longer than most epic poems. Not even a properly formatted digital document with the requisite 17 security protocols, backup systems, and emergency philosophical advisors. Paper. Actual, honest-to-goodness, tree-based paper that would have been considered primitive by civilizations that had discovered fire approximately 10 minutes after learning to rub 2 sticks together. McAllister unfolded what appeared to be, and Korth's sophisticated sensors confirmed this with a mixture of scientific fascination and existential horror. A napkin. Not just any napkin, but one bearing the cheerful logo of Luigi's orbital diner, along with the optimistic slogan, "Home of the galaxy's best coffee and reasonably accurate directions." The napkin's edges were slightly stained with what spectral analysis identified as coffee, synthetic maple syrup, and something that might have been gravy, but could equally well have been Starship engine lubricant, given the establishment's well-known reputation for practical cuisine. Upon this humble piece of dining establishment merchandise, someone had drawn what could generously be described as a map, using what appeared to be a writing implement that had clearly seen better decades and possibly better centuries. "Okay," McAllister said with the casual confidence of someone about to overturn 17 millennia of navigational science using nothing more than breakfast condiments and questionable artistic skills. "So we've got 3 cargo ships positioned here, here, and here." He pointed to spots on the napkin that had been marked with small X's drawn in what appeared to be blue ink from a pen that had been running out of ink for quite some time but was too stubborn to admit defeat. "The wormhole network is doing this kind of twisty, spinny thing through this general area." He indicated a squiggly line that looked like it had been drawn by someone experiencing mild turbulence while consuming excessive amounts of caffeine. The line meandered across the napkin with the casual abandon of someone who had never heard of the consortium's precision mapping requirements and wouldn't have particularly cared if they had. "And based on my extensive experience with similar situations and Luigi's remarkably accurate gravy stains, the safe route goes right about there." He traced a path with his finger that completely ignored approximately 2.6 million sensor readings, dismissed the consortium's infallible navigation algorithm as if it were yesterday's weather forecast, and treated the accumulated wisdom of 17 millennia of spacefaring civilization with all the respect typically accorded to the assembly instructions for furniture purchased from questionable retailers. The traced route appeared to follow what engineers would call the path of least resistance, though in this case it seemed more like the path of least paperwork and maximum common sense. "That's it." Korth's voice carried the kind of strangled disbelief typically reserved for witnessing fundamental laws of physics being casually violated by someone who had clearly never bothered to read the instruction manual. "That's your comprehensive navigational solution." A drawing on a napkin that appears to have been used as both a coaster and a plate. Well, McAllister said with obvious pride, examining his handiwork with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a complex engineering problem using nothing more than intuition and breakfast condiments. It's not just any napkin. This particular piece of paper happens to be from Luigi's Orbital Diner, which makes the best coffee in 3 sectors and whose navigational advice has proven surprisingly reliable for an establishment that also serves something called cosmic chilia that violates several health codes and at least one fundamental law of thermodynamics. The shuttle began transmitting navigation data to the trapped cargo ships, not the comprehensive sensor analyses that Korth systems had been generating at a rate that would have impressed several small planets' worth of librarians, not the elaborate computational frameworks that had been arguing among themselves for 3 days about the philosophical implications of left turns in hyperspace, but simple coordinates and headings that could have been calculated using a decent pocket calculator and a basic understanding of 3-dimensional geometry. One by one, the cargo ships began moving, following McAllister's napkin route through the wormhole network and threading between gravitational anomalies with the casual confidence of experienced drivers navigating familiar neighborhood streets. No elaborate sensor sweeps to verify every quantum fluctuation, no real-time data correlation with 17 different monitoring stations, no 17-layer verification protocols requiring approval from committees that had their own committees to oversee committee meetings. They simply went, following a route that had been plotted on a piece of paper using condiment stains as navigational reference points. The first ship, Reliable Prophet, slipped through the wormhole network with elegant precision and transmitted a brief message, "Well, I'll be completely damned." That actually worked better than anything we've tried in the past week. Thanks for the directions, and tell Luigi he still owes me 20 credits from that poker game last month. The second ship, Economic Necessity, followed with equal success, though its captain felt compelled to add, "This is either the most brilliant thing I've ever witnessed or completely insane, and at this point in my career, I'm not entirely certain there's a meaningful difference between the two categories." The third ship, Inevitable Consequence, completed the transit with a message that would become legendary in spacing circles throughout the galaxy. "I've been navigating these routes for 37 years, and this napkin thing is either the stupidest smart thing or the smartest stupid thing I've ever had the privilege to witness. Either way, I'm buying the next several rounds when we get to Luigi's." And it worked. All of it. Every single ship made it through the hazardous region safely, following a route that had been plotted on restaurant merchandise by someone who clearly approached interstellar navigation with the same casual confidence that most people reserved for finding their way to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Korth watched his sophisticated monitoring systems register the successful transit of all 3 cargo ships, their crews now safely en route to their destinations, with stories that would be retold in spacer bars for generations to come. His data processing array, still generating 40,000 potential solutions per second, seemed to have developed what could only be described as a severe nervous tic, accompanied by what sounded distinctly like electronic weeping. "I fail to understand," Korth transmitted, his crystalline form flickering between 17 different configurations as he attempted to process what had just occurred without triggering a complete philosophical crisis. "How your solution can possibly function effectively. It lacks computational rigor, ignores 97.3% of all relevant sensor data, and violates no fewer than 4,847 established safety protocols, several of which were specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of intuitive problem-solving approach." Commander Thornwick's response came through the communication system with the gentle patience of someone explaining a fundamental truth of the universe to a very confused artificial intelligence, because sometimes, archive mind, the answer to a problem isn't buried somewhere in the middle of all that data you've been collecting. Sometimes it's about knowing which data you can safely ignore, and sometimes it's about remembering that the universe existed and functioned perfectly well for billions of years before anyone thought to monitor it with 2.7 million sensors. The aftermath of what the consortium would eventually classify as the Napkin incident, a designation that would require its own 847-page documentation process, reshaped galactic civilization in ways both profound and utterly ridiculous. The cargo ship crews experienced what psychologists later termed existential bewilderment upon learning that their rescue had been accomplished using navigation equipment that could be purchased at any decent convenience store for the approximate cost of a sandwich and a cup of coffee. Data keeper Xylothian Prime 7, receiving detailed reports from 17 different monitoring stations, confirming that humans had successfully solved in 30 minutes what had taken the consortium's finest minds 3 days to make exponentially more complicated. Experienced what he would later describe as a bureaucratic epiphany, and decided that perhaps it was time to fundamentally reconsider the basic assumptions underlying galactic navigation protocols. This decision led directly to the development of the Simplified Navigation Initiative, a revolutionary program that reduced the average navigation calculation from 47,832 discrete steps to approximately 7, eliminated the need for Form 99 Alpha Delta Sigma entirely, and resulted in what historians would call the Great Bureaucratic Simplification, during which roughly 73% of all consortium paperwork was declared officially redundant and converted into fuel for emergency heating systems. Archive Mind Corp's official report, titled Computational Limitations in the Face of Intuitive Problem-Solving Methodologies, became required reading at the Consortium Academy. His conclusion would be quoted in academic papers for generations. The universe operates according to principles of elegant simplicity that become unnecessarily complicated only when filtered through excessive institutional analysis. The humans have demonstrated that true sophistication sometimes consists of treating complex problems as if they were not complex at all. Commander Thornwick and Captain McAllister returned to their patrol duties, carrying with them the quiet satisfaction of people who had solved a significant problem by refusing to make it more complicated than absolutely necessary. McAllister kept the famous napkin, framing it in his quarters beside his collection of obsolete navigation instruments that had somehow managed to guide humanity across the galaxy before anyone knew enough to be properly terrified of the undertaking. The napkin incident served as a reminder that sometimes the most advanced civilization is simply the one that remembers when simple solutions work best, especially when accompanied by decent coffee and a complete disregard for proper bureaucratic procedure.